a lot of African countries, a lot of African sports writers, a lot of African pundits, a lot of African content creators, a lot of African football fans have been celebrating the fact that we have 9 African countries in the knockout stage of the World Cup. That has never happened before. We first celebrated the fact that we had 10 African countries at the World Cup. Big feat. But you need to understand where African countries started from to appreciate the excitement in the air. It's not just about having 9 African countries in the knockout stage or 10 African countries at the World Cup. It's about the journey that African countries had to embark on to get to this stage. My name is China Ikwereman Acheru, and I'm Nigeria's #1 storyteller. Now, people wonder why there was no African country in the first World Cup in 1930. And it's simple. At the 1930 World Cup, Egypt was the only African country that was affiliated to FIFA. A lot of the other countries had not gotten their independence yet. Now, then we had South Africa that was a member of the British Football Association. But the South Africans could not go to the World Cup. You know why? Now, the British at that time had an issue with FIFA between amateurism and professionalism, and FIFA insisting that if amateur players should leave their jobs to play at the World Cup, then you must pay them a certain amount of money for those days they miss, and the British would not. So none of the British Isles was part of the 1930 World Cup, and that World Cup was, people played the World Cup based on invitation, not qualification. So Egypt was invited, but they missed their boats. Logistic issues. Now they're supposed to take a boat from their country, Egypt, from Cairo to Marseille in France, and join the Yugoslavs in another boat that would take them to the World Cup venue. But a storm in the Mediterranean delayed them by 1 day. And by the time they arrived in France, the Yugoslavs had left. So they returned to Egypt and sent their apologies. And that was how there was no African country at the 1930 World Cup. The 1934 World Cup, Egypt qualified because then they were still the only African country available at the time. Egypt beat Palestine 11-2 to qualify for the World Cup, and then lost to Hungary 4-2 to be knocked out. In the 1938 World Cup, Egypt were paired against Romania because then the Africans, which was only Egypt at that time, had to play against European teams to qualify for the World Cup. So they had a game against Romania, but the game fell a day after Ramadan fasting was to have ended. And Egyptians said, listen, we need an extra day to play this game. Can FIFA give us an extra day? And FIFA said no. So the Egyptians did not bother to play against Romania. They pulled out of the World Cup qualifiers. In the 1950 World Cup, we realized that there are no World Cups in 1942 and 1946 because of the World War. So the Africans were paired against the Oceania region. But the Egyptians looked at the World Cup and felt this World Cup is meant to favor just the European and the South American teams. So they decided not to play the World Cup. Let's push to 1954 World Cup. Africa again was put in the European group. And again, it was just Egypt as the only recognized African country. And they played the qualifier against Italy and they lost 7-2. So the Italians qualified for the World Cup and there was no African country in that World Cup. You can take time out to like my page, follow, share, subscribe to my channel to get more of these historical stories I tell you. So for the 1958 World Cup qualifiers, we now had 4 African countries eligible to play the World Cup. One was Egypt, then there was South Africa, there was Ethiopia, and there was Sudan. Now, South Africa could not go because of the apartheid policies and the bans. Ethiopia, we are not allowed to participate. I'm not sure why we were not allowed to participate. So it was left with just Sudan and Egypt. Now remember, they were in a group that had Israel. And these 2 countries said they will not play in a group that will play against Israel. So they pulled out. And that's why there was no African country represented at the 1958 World Cup. In 1962, it was Africa Asia, and North America to be in the same qualifying group, right? And the winner of that qualifying group will go into a playoff with either a European or South American team. Now, let me shock you. Egypt and Sudan, they won their qualifying group and were ready for the playoffs. But a monsoon hit and they couldn't travel. And they asked FIFA, can you postpone by a few days, let the monsoon clear and we can travel? And FIFA rejected. So by the World Cup in 1966, there were 15 African countries eligible to play the World Cup. But they told themselves, hey, why are we doing this when we're not sure we'll be at the World Cup? And they demanded to have one automatic slot for Africa, which FIFA turned down. So all 15 of them boycotted the World Cup, and that's why there was still no African country at the 1966 World Cup. But by 1970 World Cup, FIFA agreed to give Africa its lone slot at the World Cup. And that was how Egypt qualified for the World Cup in 1970. In 1974, Africa still had one slot, which was Zaire. Remember the 9-0 thrashing by Yugoslavia. In 1978, Africa still had one slot, which was Tunisia. And that was when Africa won its first game at the World Cup, with Tunisia beating Mexico by 3-1. By the next World Cup in 1982, Africa now had two slots to themselves, Cameroon and Algeria. Cameroon did not lose a game, though they failed to qualify from the group. Algeria won 2 games against Peru and against West Germany, yet they still did not qualify. Remember the disgrace of Hihon? That was 1982. In 86, still 2 African countries. But by 1990, after Cameroon did the unthinkable, Africa got 3 slots in 94, which was Nigeria, Cameroon, and Morocco. And by 98, Africa now had 5 slots. In 2010, Africa had 6 slots because South Africa was the host. And now Africa has 10 slots. So when you see African nations celebrate the fact that they have 10 countries at the World Cup with 9 qualifying for the knockout stage, go back to 1930 to understand how the journey started. My name is China Acheru, and nobody tells it quite like me.